hand. Not today, but to another class. Okay, I'm seeing some heads bouncing yes. I asked you to consider, now the thesis of fashion and film is that there is a synergistic relationship between film and fashion. That film influences fashion trends. At the same time, fashion influences film. And the documentarians seem to settle upon the thesis that one of the reasons why people adopt the fashions of movie stars is because they get caught up in the characters and that they want to be like those characters, and so they buy clothes that associates them with those characters. How else do you think film influences people? Do you have any suggestions, hypotheses? If you have a good hypothesis, I'll test it and study. That's what I do. I test media effects.
Sexual orientation.
How so?
Because with media now, they're starting to display things that usually wouldn't be displayed, and it's becoming more well known that there are other options, I guess.
Options?
So it gives people a new insight into the world.
Okay. Yeah, we know that people under 30 are much more accepting of same-sex marriage than people who are over 30. It might be because of television programming. Television programming has changed substantially in the past 20 years. I am aware of one study done by researchers at the University of Minnesota which shows that people who get involved with characters like on programs like Will and Grace, 6 Feet Under, and there's a comedy act by the name of somebody named Izzard. He's a transvestite. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh,
Eddie Izzard, right. Okay, that was the study. They looked at those 3 programs. They looked at Eddie Izzard, they looked at 6 Feet Under, which you probably don't know of, but it's an HBO show where one of the features, one of the protagonists is a homosexual. It's Michael C. Davis. He also plays Dexter on the Showtime show Dexter. And then, of course, there's Will and Grace, which I'm sure you're aware of, and Will, of course, is homosexual in that show. Anyway, they found that people who watched those programs who already had gay friends who were unaffected by those programs. They already sort of accepted homosexuality and their attitudes were not prone to influence. However, if somebody watched those programs but did not already have gay friends, then they became more accepting of homosexuality after watching those programs. And so there is research which does show that people who watch, that when you watch programs that feature homosexual protagonists, that you become more accepting of the homosexual, I don't know if you can call it a lifestyle, because a lot of homosexuals would say that it's not a choice. So that's a controversial question as to whether or not homosexuality is a choice or a lifestyle. What else? How else do you think of media? I know this literature, so I can tell you whether or not there actually is an effect. Anything else?
vernacular.
Vernacular. That's really interesting. Vernacular. I know that, I think that is the case. I think that media does influence vernacular. I'm trying to think of studies that have shown an influence on vernacular, and I can't think of any right offhand. But it would be interesting to see what the relationship is. Is the relationship that, is it that people start using a certain term and then it shows up in the media? Or is it the other way around?
Other way around.
That a term appears in the media and then people start to use it. Now there are some television shows that have introduced terms into the vernacular. So for example, I'm trying to think, can anybody think of one?
That's what she said.
That's what she said. Yep, that comes from The Office, right? The Office makes it cool to say that's what she said. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to see. I don't know of any studies that show that vernacular, but I do think that it certainly does influence the vernacular. It makes sense.
What about like your outlook on like relationships?
Yeah,
Violence.
we'll do that next. What's that?
Violence makes people easier to like deal with violence.
Right. The theory of cultivation theory, the one that was innovated by George Gerbner back in the late 60s and early 1970s, actually, Gerbner got a ton of money from the federal government to study the influence of media violence on people, and that's what started that whole research program. And what Gerbner found is that, in fact, what television does is television makes people more accepting of violence as a means of solving problems. And it also elicits what's called the mean world syndrome. And so he noticed that people who watched a lot of TV believed that the world was meaner than it actually is. They believed that crime was more probable. They believed that people couldn't be trusted as much who watched more television. And they had what was called the mean world syndrome. They had less social trust, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the really interesting finding from that is that people who experienced the mean world syndrome, or who expressed that they had a mean world viewpoint, they were also more accepting of harsh government policies, of limiting civil liberties in order to improve public safety. And so they were actually less supportive of civil liberties, which is kind of an interesting finding. It's not a direct finding, but it moves through the mean world syndrome. And yeah, there is a relationship there. Relationships?
Yeah, like, I was watching this movie with my wife the other night, and the couple's like dancing in the living room without music. She's like, "Oh, we do that." I'm like, it's a movie. We don't do that in real life.
Sure. What happens is, and there is research which shows that romantic comedies change people's expectations for relationships. And I'm not familiar with the specific outcomes of that research. Like, I don't know how it changes their expectations. But I do know of research that shows that people who consume more television believe that there is more marital discord. That is that people have more fights in their marriage, or more conflict in their marriage than they actually do. Because, of course, television is narrative-based. Narrative is based on drama. Drama is based on conflict. And so if you pick families, you pick conflict. And so, yeah, there is research that does show it changes people's expectations of what a good relationship is. And I did read in a book long ago by a fellow by the name of Leach. It was called Merchants of Desire. It was about the development of the advertising industry in America. And what it talked about was that in the 1930s, movie stars started to use diamond engagement rings. And after the 1930s, it became common for people to start buying diamond engagement rings. But prior to that, engagement rings weren't necessarily diamonds. So that was something. And if we were to continue to watch fashion and film, this is all anecdotal, this wasn't scientifically studied. There was a situation where Clark Gable, back in the 1930s, didn't wear an undershirt in a very popular movie, and all of a sudden the sale of undershirts plummeted. And actually the undershirt industry went back to Hollywood and said, we need major stars to wear undershirts again because it's hurting our industry. Hollywood capitulated, and the undershirt industry went back into fashion. Yeah.
The movie was It Happened One Night.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Did you finish watching Fashion and Film?
No, I did, but I saw the movie and we watched a documentary about the film.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Thanks. That's it. That was also in fashion. It's interesting. That is what I study, but mostly what I study is I don't necessarily study what's called the main effect of media on attitudes. I usually study the process or the means by which media is influential. And so as a community of researchers, and I'm going to be hanging out with that community next week when I go down to New Orleans for the National Communication Association Conference. As a community of researchers, we've concluded that media definitely has an impact. Audiovisual media is particularly strong. We can generally explain about 2 to 3% of the variance in people's attitudes based upon just their media consumption. But the thing we want to know now is we want to know how it is that media is influential. We want to know that why one program influences an audience and why another program doesn't influence an audience. Or in my case, why one political advertisement influences an audience and another one doesn't. Now we're looking at several processes. Some of those processes